I don't often talk about movies here. Initially, when I started producing videos, I intended to also cover a wider area of media because, like so many other opinionated nerds out there, I'm a big fan of film as a medium. I particularly enjoy science fiction movies for a variety of reasons. As such, it won't come as a surprise when I tell you that my favorite movie of all time is Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now this is a pretty predictable pick for a favorite movie. It's not particularly out there, it's well liked by both critics and audiences, and it has a long legacy of people vouching for its supposed quality. It's also clearly an inspiration for many other creative people who have seen it. Which brings me to Observation. Observation seems to have looked at 2001 and thought, okay, but what if that movie was shot from the perspective of the ship's computer? In fact, I'm almost certain that that was the exact thought process the creative lead had. He used to work at Creative Assembly on Alien Isolation when one article in particular brought up the idea of the movie Alien, but seen from the Xenomorph's perspective. This type of deconstruction isn't particularly new, making the villain, or at least another important character in the story, the focus and thus more sympathetic has been a thing in a variety of media for a long time now. And it has been useful to examine how villain portrayals can often fall flat because their motivations and goals are entirely unclear. But before we get into the specifics of the story, let's discuss the gameplay first. In Observation, you're put into the role of HAL 9000, the ship's computer of 2001. Not the exact same role, but you are in control of the computer and surveillance systems of the titular space station. You're referred to as SAM, an acronym for Systems Administration and Maintenance. Now that on its own is interesting, and I like the gameplay that arises out of it. Jumping from camera to camera on the station in order to link up to various other devices and solving a variety of puzzles was fun. You also get to control a little sphere to fly through the station and even do some extravehicular activity. On the gameplay front, the game is pretty enjoyable. I would have liked for the 6th degree of movement controls of the sphere to also provide the ability to go up and down, because ascending or descending parallel to something else isn't possible, but that's about the extent of it. On the whole, there's not much to talk about in terms of gameplay. No, what I have issues with is the story, but in order to really discuss why, I will have to spoil both the game as well as the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. So if you don't want to hear those spoilers, skip to this time code for the conclusion. Now, I'm not sure if Observation achieves its intended deconstruction here. Sure, it puts you into a similar role as the ship's computer of 2001, but to me it doesn't really do much with this idea. But first, some context. For the uninitiated, the plot of 2001: A Space Odyssey concerns the discovery of an anomalous object on the moon, a black monolith that sends out a strong radio signal. The signal's apparent destination is somewhere around Jupiter in the movie, while it's Saturn in the first novel, though that gets retconned by the second one. This sets in motion an interplanetary expedition to Jupiter to figure out the reason for the signal and who might have been the recipient. Most of the crew are put into stasis, so the majority of the film follows 2 astronauts keeping the lights on, as well as the ship's central computer system called HAL 9000, or HAL for short. Much of the film is about the day-to-day routine of the people on board and their interactions with HAL. At some point, however, HAL seems to malfunction, which causes great concern to the 2 astronauts. They intend to shut down most of HAL's higher functions because they fear that further errors in his judgment might jeopardize the mission. HAL figures out their plan and retaliates. So he's clearly coded as a villainous presence in the film. However, I feel something that people often gloss over when reading the film is HAL's motivation here. He's not just some malfunctioning machine. In fact, the one thing that I feel many people ignore is the possibility that HAL is sentient and alive. And I think the developers actually agree with me here. Now bear with me here, I'll have to wind back to the beginning of the film. No, not just with the apes, I mean the literal beginning of the movie. 2001 starts with a black sequence set to music by Hungarian composer György Ligeti. His music gets used throughout the film very frequently. In fact, it always gets used whenever the black monolith makes an appearance and becomes active, both in outer space as well as on Earth during the prehistoric dawn of man setting at the start of the film. Every time the monolith appears, it symbolizes something. To the pre-human apes, it represents a leap in evolution, as signified by their appropriation of tools and weapons that secured their dominance as a species. At the end of the film, it represents Dr. Bowman's ascension to a higher state of being by rapidly living through his later stages of life before being being reborn into the space baby. So what does the black screen at the start set to music symbolize? Well, my guess would be the creation of the species on Earth. See, the whole Chariots of the Gods idea that mankind had its possible origins in extraterrestrial visitors was really popular back in the 60s. And it even crops up sometimes today in less than stellar movies. Now, I don't want to make the claim that this particular book was the influence on either Stanley Kubrick or Arthur C. Clarke, because they came out pretty much concurrently. And the actual inspiration for 2001, which is another story by Clarke called The Sentinel, came out in 1951. But it is an interesting parallel. Either way, my interpretation of this sequence is that it symbolizes the creation of all life on Earth by extraterrestrial visitors. But how is that related to Hal being alive? Well, that black sequence set to music appears twice. Once at the start of the film and once at the intermission, right after the astronauts discuss what they intend to do about Hal and right before he murders one of them by throwing him into deep space. Now, I posit here that Hal is a sentient being at this point, and to Hal, the prospect of having their higher functions shut down is akin to a lobotomy. So it makes perfect sense for Hal to retaliate and fight for their life. Hal isn't so much the villain of the piece as it is the logical consequence of building sophisticated artificial intelligence. The question whether we deem them sentient and eventually give them rights isn't directly posed in 2001, but it's certainly one of the aspects the story touches upon. In any case, this isn't supposed to be an exploration of 2001. It's supposed to be a review of Observation, so why did I take this long to finally get to the point? Well, Observation clearly takes a lot of inspiration from 2001, so it's important to set the stage if I want to critique it in the context of that movie. The basic gist of the narrative is that the Observation, the titular space station of the game, experiences some kind of incident. You learn pretty quickly that the station used to be in Earth orbit, but has for some reason been transported to Saturn, and most of the crew are missing, with the exception of Dr. Emma Fisher, the actual protagonist of the narrative. Pretty much the entire first half of the game is spent exploring and fixing stuff aboard the station. You do end up finding a few members of your crew, but most of them are dead. At some point, Emma notices another man-made object in Saturn's orbit and attempts to make contact. At first, she believes that it might be a rescue vessel sent from Earth, which prompts her to leave her station and jump over to the other vessel. But it turns out to be another space station that is identical to the Observation. Things only get weirder when you encounter Station Captain Jim Elias on this copy, because back on your station, you've found his corpse already. The plot leans heavily into the multiverse direction here, with many other identical stations appearing in orbit. It turns out that the captain was the only person on board who knew what the mission was about, which was to get a specific set of people to a particular spot near Earth that was indicated by a bunch of signals and see what happens. That's the incident that transported the Observation to Saturn in the first place. To me, this seems eerily similar to the monoliths in 2001 being used as interstellar portals that transport Dr. Bowman from the orbit of Jupiter to wherever the hell he ends up after the psychedelic light show. Anyway, the copy station is out of power, so Jim takes Emma back to the original station only to leave her stuck outside. His only goal here is to get back to Earth, so he uses technobabble quantum communication to talk to Earth without the typical time delay, while also trying to lock you out of all the cameras. I guess this is supposed to mirror the sequence where Bowman shuts down Hal's higher functions, but that really doesn't happen, and nothing in the game seems to indicate that there's any sense of urgency or dramatic tension to getting the ship back under your control. Sure, Emma is outside with a hole in her suit, but the game doesn't put much emphasis on it. There's no timer to get her back in before the oxygen runs out, and you can take as long as you want to solve the puzzles shown to you. After you manage to get the central system back online and confirm with Earth that this isn't the original Jim and that there are two versions, one alive and one deceased on board of the station, they cut communication. And after that, you get the message to kill Jim. But this message isn't sent from Earth. No, you ostensibly get it from whoever sent that initial signal pointing to that special spot in Earth orbit, who has also transported the station to Saturn. You know, like that message from 2010. And this isn't the first message you get from them, by the way. The initial message you get just states to quote-unquote bring her, which implies that they want Emma Fisher for some reason, which Jim confirms after he locks her out of the station. Once he's dealt with, you let Emma back into the station. She seems somewhat different than before and talks about knowing what she needs to do. Over the course of the game, the station has been moving closer and closer to Saturn's hexagonal polar storm, and it's implied that Sam has been maneuvering the station into that position over time. I'm not sure how much I believe that, because this just seems like a cop-out to have the station end up where it needs to be. Nothing we as players do supports this claim, and even though we are instructed by whoever sends these signals to bring her, nothing we do is related to that. Once you do get to Saturn, you crash somewhere and get walked through a landscape littered with alternate versions of the station and Emma, indicating that this is some kind of convergence point for all the multiverses. Emma confronts a black hexagon that has been making multiple appearances over the course of the game, and then the game just ends. Nothing about the inciting incident or the conclusion of the story ever get elaborated upon. And even the gimmick of playing the game from the perspective of the ship's AI is entirely wasted, because it doesn't really factor into anything. There's no deconstruction going on here, at least not as far as I can tell. You can quote-unquote disobey certain commands a couple of times in the game, but nothing ever comes out of it. You can't just switch the perspective of a piece and claim that that alone counts as a deconstruction. See, my problem with the narrative here isn't that it's a pastiche of elements from 2001. I don't mind taking inspiration from something and doing your own thing with it. And I'm not comparing the game to the film to point out all the differences and say, well, in the film X happens, but in the game Y happens, and therefore it's bad. This isn't an adaptation after all. What I take issue with is that the author who took inspiration from the film ostensibly didn't actually understand 2001. It has its own analog for the monolith, the black hexagon, because obviously hexagons are the bestagons, but to me it just feels like a superficial appropriation and not something interesting on its own. The game implies that Sam is alive and that Emma felt what Sam felt while dealing with Jim, but nothing ever arises out of that. Heck, the game even ends by having Emma's and Sam's consciousness combine, just like in the later Odyssey novels where Hal and Dr. Bowman get combined into Hellman, but nothing about this event is explained. Even the only thing it actually adds thematically, the multiverse stuff, is left entirely unresolved, at best a cliffhanger for an eventual sequel. 2001 was a vague movie. It left a lot of room for interpretation, and it also ended on an open note. But if you look at the details, you can come to a coherent picture of what the elements mean and where they point towards. It also helps that there are literally 4 books explaining it, but the film itself, looked at in isolation, also offers enough material on its own, even if it is ambiguous. Observation superficially takes elements from 2001, but doesn't arrange them in any meaningful way that lends itself to piecing together a larger whole from its individual parts. To me, it seems like Observation is a sloppy attempt at mimicry that massively misses its mark by only highlighting that the author didn't really understand what made his influence so great to begin with. If anything, it seems that the author thought 2001 was just a story about space exploration gone wrong and embellished it with trippy sequences for stylistic purposes instead of thematic and narrative ones. Putting you in the role of the ship's computer was interesting, and I liked the gameplay that arose from that decision. I can recommend the game if you want a few interesting puzzles against the backdrop of some mindless sci-fi, but don't go into it thinking that the narrative goes to any great lengths to explore themes and ideas. It's popcorn flick level plotting and theming at best, not something that wants you to have your brain turned on.